Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm Jordan LaPier. On the program this week, the latest border apprehension numbers in context, the deal that staved off tariffs on Mexico, and legislative action in the House. But before we get started, please remember you can subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you leave a review, it'll help more people find our show. You can also stream This Week in Immigration on our website at bipartisanpolicy.org/podcasts. And as always, check out bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration for more information on the stories we discuss here on the show. And here with me today, as always, are Theresa Cardinal Brown, Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy. She's on Twitter at BPC_T Brown. Hi, Theresa.
Hi, Jordan.
And Cris Ramón, Senior Immigration Policy Analyst on Twitter at CRamonBPC. Hi, Cris.
Doing well. How are you?
Good. All right, let's start today with apprehensions at the U.S. Mexico border. The figures for May are out, and Customs and Border Protection says it apprehended more than 130,000 people during the month. That's the sixth highest number ever recorded. Apprehensions of what are termed family units hit a historic high with more than 84,000 of them apprehended. These are levels unseen since 2009 and have led to another round of calls from the Trump administration for hardline deterrence measures. So, Cris, walk us through these numbers and what's significant about them and what they say about the trends so far this year.
Right. So, as you said, overall apprehensions in May 2019 was about 132,000 individuals. This is now the sixth highest peak in monthly Southwest border apprehensions since we started tracking this around the year 2000. So that's really significant. You're also seeing, as you noticed, with family unit apprehensions, so those are, individuals that are part of a family, or at least CBP identifies as part of a family, that spiked to 84,542. And, we wrote a blog post about this, and in that blog post I said there is no historic precedent for this number. Simply put, we've never had this level in the history of since CBP's been tracking this. So that's important. But the thing about May that's a little bit scary is that this isn't the only record that's been broken. Unaccompanied child apprehensions actually increased to about 11,500. That's actually higher than the peaks that we saw when the UAC crisis, the unaccompanied child crisis, hit in the year 2014. It's actually higher than those numbers. So we're really seeing a large number of individuals. And even in terms of individual apprehensions, we're also seeing pretty high levels, especially compared to what we've seen over the last year. So I think across the board, just a lot of really high numbers, a lot of records being broken, and I think that we're really seeing a continued influx and surge of individuals reaching the U.S. Mexico border.
What's behind the recent spike, and are there new factors at play here that have changed things?
So one of the things we've been seeing in the commentary is this question, why now? Why is this happening? Why are we seeing the surge? So, obviously, as we've been talking about this over the last year, we talk about the push factors, violence and lack of economic opportunities for the individuals in the Northern Triangle, and people have been talking about the pull factors. We've been talking about the immigration court backlog and how that plays into it. But I think one of the things that we've been sort of thinking about more is what I'm calling enabling factors, things that make it easier for an individual to say, you know what, I'm going to leave Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and I'm going to go to the United States. And I think one of the things that we've been seeing with this is the role of smuggling cartels and other organizations that essentially serve as a service for individuals who want to leave the Northern Triangle to arrive to the U.S. Mexico border.
Yeah, this is Theresa. I think the role of the smugglers, especially right now, I mean, they are openly advertising on radio in these countries saying, all of the harsh rhetoric coming out of the United States, now is the time to go before the border shuts down, right? So they're encouraging travel now. They are facilitating it in ways that have never previously been seen, literally coach busloads of migrants to the border. Just in the last month, CBP saw the largest single group, over 1,000 migrants at one time at the southwest border who arrived. So it's not just the families, it's not just the minors, it's just volume. And it's almost exclusively now from the Northern Triangle countries of, of Central America. So it's a combination of factors. It's been growing over time. The other thing I would say is that the communications networks among migrants are almost instantaneous. So when a neighbor from a village or prior family member arrives in the United States, they are pretty much very quickly able to tell their fellows, I made it, I'm here, and I'm going to be here for a while. I now have a job within a couple of weeks. I've settled in, and now's the time to come. So with all of that sort of encouraging the migration flow, it's really difficult for, I think, the messages of the U.S. government or the Mexican government or anyone else not to come to get through. And I think that it's a combination of the desperation of people in those countries seeking a better life, the fact that there are pre-existing migrant groups in the United States from those countries that are encouraging the flow, and then, as Cris said, the enabling of the smuggling organizations that are saying we can get you there and we can get you there quick and easy and fast.
Yeah, I mean, the way to think about it is that these enabling factors that we're talking about have always existed, at least since the 70s, from this region to the United States. It's just that right now the sophistication that they have is really important. So in the 70s, somebody could call from Los Angeles down to San Salvador and say, hey, I got in, that's fine, but you had to pay for that call. Now it's instantaneous. You can send a WhatsApp message and it'll get there right away. Yes, there were coyotes and there are individuals operating between Central America and the United States, but those were largely mom and pop operations. Now the level of sophistication, I mean, they're operating almost like transportation companies and very, very sophisticated. So these things have always existed, but I think the sophistication and the extent of which that they're able to operate, or at least with communication with migrants, these new technology, all these tools that can enable that, I think has really enabled this to be able to expand beyond numbers that we saw.
I would also just say that the fact that we have now been experiencing these numbers for a prolonged period of time, and just the complete nature of the overwhelming of our border system to manage it is also a factor here, right? The migrants themselves have noticed, and the smugglers have factored this in, the more that come, the more likely they are to be released relatively quickly, within a couple of days, if that. And so they have sort of seen now the impacts of the volume on our system, and basically think of it like, they have completely overwhelmed the system, so there's very little that the border officials can do, and absent, major changes, this is likely to continue.
I mean, and just to sort of finish that point is, yeah, obviously Guatemala and El Salvador had very brutal civil wars in the 70s and 80s, and that obviously led a lot of individuals from those countries to find refuge in other parts of the world. But it's just simply the numbers of individuals arriving at the border from that part of the world during those wars just didn't match the same numbers. They were going to other countries as well. So it's this large number of flows, and the way that the U.S. border system just hasn't been able to adjust to that. That's been one of the driving factors.
So how is the Trump administration reacting to these new numbers? And setting aside the threat of tariffs from the president, which we're going to talk about in the next segment, and that appears to be off the table for now, what else is the administration considering right now in terms of deterrence?
So the administration is pushing Congress very hard to change legislation relating to the asylum process, who is eligible to claim asylum, how long they can hold families in custody, because they believe that the release of families into the interior of the United States is one of the things that's encouraging more migration. They're also looking at regulatory changes they can do without Congress. So, for example, there's been rumors that the Department of Justice is readying a regulation that would essentially say that if you have traveled through another country that you could have applied for asylum in before getting to the United States and you did not, then you would not be eligible for asylum in the United States. It's sort of a unilateral safe third country declaration that the United States would say, oh, you should have applied in Mexico. We haven't seen that regulation yet. It's rumored to be pending, and we have heard various parts of the administration talk about this. Whether or not that is in abeyance right now because of the discussions with Mexico, I'm not sure, but they are looking at every thing they have in their arsenal. And they are expanding the Remain in Mexico policy, where they return migrants to Mexico to await court hearings. They believe that is also a deterrent for migrants to come to the United States. So they're very much leaning heavily into what can we do to deter migrants or prevent them from getting to the United States to claim asylum.
All right, up ahead, more on those tariff threats and the White House's deal with Mexico. The White House is touting a new deal reached with the Mexican government in which Mexico has promised to do more to manage the flow of Central American migrants at its own southern border. The deal came after President Trump threatened a series of escalating tariffs on Mexican goods entering the United States, and it was reached hours before the first of those tariffs were set to take effect. But we're still learning more about the details. So, Cris, what do we know at this point about the deal and how both sides came to reach it?
Basically, Mexico agreed to deploying its National Guard, which is actually a new body of law enforcement they had to create for this purpose, to the southern Guatemalan-Mexican border, and deploying 6,000 of these troops to the border. It will also take, quote-unquote, decisive action to tackle human smuggling networks. And in response, the United States agreed to expanding the Remain in Mexico program that's been operating since at least December, and Theresa mentioned this in the last segment, and that's what it's going to be doing, extending this across the whole U.S Mexico border. So that's kind of the basic outlines of what was agreed to. Now, how did we get here? Basically, last month, President Trump at least got wind of the number of apprehensions that arrived at the U.S. Mexico border and decided to go on Twitter and threaten to impose a 5% tariff on all Mexican goods entering the United States, and that the tariff would start on June 10th. And for each successive month that the Mexican government didn't meet his requirements of stopping migration entering into Mexico to reach the United States, he would impose an additional 5% until it would cap off at 25%. This set off a lot of alarm bells in Mexico City, and the Mexican government sent its diplomatic corps and its lead diplomat, who's the foreign minister, Ebrard, to Washington to begin negotiating the terms of this deal. It happened more or less over the course of 3 to 4 days, and they finally reached this agreement. Now, what's important and what's actually being discussed right now is whether or not this is the end point of the negotiation. And what we've been hearing is that there might be an additional component to this deal where if the Mexican government doesn't feel that it's meeting the goals of the administration to stop migration, or at least undocumented migration, into its southern border, that there would be discussions about a regional migration plan. Now, this is where things get fuzzy, because what the details of this regional migration plan is, nobody knows. There's a discussion that it will be a quote-unquote safe third policy where individuals enter Mexico and have to apply for asylum there because they entered there. There's also discussions that it might be more expansive, though, where individuals that enter from, say, Honduras into El Salvador, that those individuals have to apply for asylum in those countries before. And that's a little bit more like the EU asylum system that they have, which is called the Dublin III regulation, where if you enter into the EU, into the country of first entry, that's where you need to apply for asylum. So this might be something that they're considering. But once again, the details are a little bit sparse, because at this point, the administration, I think Mexico, want to see where this goes. But right now, all that we know about the second phase is Donald Trump waved a piece of paper in a press conference, and there were details that a Washington Post reporter took a photo of, and it said at this point, in 45 days, Mexico will decide on the next phase. But like I said, a lot of details are up in the air.
Yeah, there's been a little bit of back and forth since the announcement of this joint declaration and the public pronouncements of the National Guard troops and Mexico acceding to expansion of the Remain in Mexico policy about whether or not there was a quote-unquote secret deal. The president seemed to indicate there were. The Mexican government vociferously denied that. The president seemed to indicate that this deal would be akin to safe third. Again, the Mexican government said, no, what happens is we put these measures in place, we see what happens in 45 days. At that point, if the U.S. government's not satisfied, if it hasn't had an impact, then we will negotiate some sort of regional accord. It's that point that I think that may be a difference in understanding of what that accord looks like between the Mexican side and the U.S. side. clearly the United States wants something that says you cannot apply for asylum in the United States if you've been somewhere else first and you didn't apply there. They want to be able to deny people the right to apply for asylum in the United States. Mexico, I think, is looking at a different kind of arrangement. It might be something akin to what Cris was talking about, a right of first country. That's certainly also something the United States would be fine with. But I think it might be more along the lines of a regional burden sharing agreement. Eduard talked in his press conference in Mexico City about inviting UNHCR to the table, about talking with countries like Brazil and Costa Rica and other regional countries about a broader migration pact. That's a very different thing than I think what the U.S. administration is maybe thinking that they're talking about. So again, until we sort of see what happens with this first round of things in 45 days, then we see what happens next. But already I would say that the back and forth after the negotiations between Washington and Mexico City on the content of that makes the idea of a broader set of negotiations somewhat questionable. It's not clear the United States would be interested in doing that kind of a thing. And it's unclear whether Mexico, frankly, we have to see. This deal didn't go down great in Mexico. There was a lot of question, I think, among the Mexican public. The Mexican press are sort of saying, did the United States kowtow to the Americans? The Mexican president has said he doesn't want to fight with President Trump. He wants to have an open hand, but he wants to preserve Mexico's dignity. And that's a hard balancing act to do. And so I think that, again, if in 45 days the administration and Trump threatens another round of tariffs, the Mexican government is going to be under severe domestic pressure, I think, to stand up to the United States in spite of the threat of tariffs. So again, this whatever happened, the fact that there was some kind of agreement reached, I don't think has lessened the tension between the United States and Mexico. In fact, I think it may have ratcheted it up.
But I think the other thing to consider, though, is that if this plan, the next phase of the negotiations, if it goes through, if it's a plan that includes the Northern Triangle countries or other countries in South America, that then what would happen is that this would likely have to be a multilateral negotiation. And I don't see President Trump being a particular fan. His background has always been one-on-one negotiations. That's always been his background as somebody who has done these types of deals as a real estate builder. But I don't think he does well in multilateral negotiations where there's going to have to be a lot of concessions. So I think that that's something else that's going to be considered. What are people? What are these other countries going to make a demand of? And I think that's something to be considering as we look at what's going to happen in the future.
So going back to before this deal was reached, we heard a number of Senate Republicans critical of President Trump's tariff threats in the days beforehand. How has Congress, especially congressional Republicans, reacted to the agreement?
A big sigh of relief, I think. Look, I mean, Trump has used tariffs in ways that members of Congress, including members of his own party, have objected strenuously to. The aluminum steel tariffs with Canada and Mexico were an obstacle to moving forward with the ratification of USMCA, and that was in part because Republicans said, "Hey, we got to get rid of those." They're not necessarily a fan of the threatened tariffs against China, and certainly many members of Congress expressed dismay when President Trump threatened these tariffs against Mexico. I think, I think there was a big sigh of relief, particularly among Republicans, that they would not have to have some kind of showdown with the White House over it, that at least for now, it seems to be off the table. But I think if it comes back, and particularly if they go into effect, you will see more members of Congress trying to figure out what they can do to appease the president, ameliorate the tariffs, because it does have an impact. As much as it impacts Mexico, it also impacts the United States. And the president has also said that he very, very much wants to get the USMCA ratified as soon as possible. It's hard to think that Mexico or the United States would have an easier time ratifying if these tariffs are in effect. So he's got to figure out how he balances two priorities of his administration here.
One of the interesting components of this politically is that he tied trade to immigration. I can't think of another president, at least in the last three administrations, where this was explicitly linked up. And I think that forced particularly Senate Republicans, in a position where they're not comfortable, because in some ways, I think they largely do agree with the president that something needs to be done with regards to the number of migrants entering Mexico and reaching the United States. But I think that the fact that it was tied to another core issue of them of interest, which is trade, really put them in a position where they had to kind of make a hard call. And so as a result, once again, what's going to happen if the threat of tariffs comes back in? Are they going to be, thinking, should we tackle this as a trade issue and try to say, President, Mr. Trump, please back down? Or are we going to try to treat this as an immigration issue and kind of see the tariffs as a side product, or at least an externality of the decision that the president is making? So I think the linking of the two issues really put them in the bind. And as long as these two issues are continuing to be linked, it's going to put them in a very difficult position.
One last thing I would just say is that I think there's been enough concern in Congress about the president's use of tariff authorities that there have been bills introduced by Republicans that would restrict his authority to unilaterally impose tariffs without congressional approval. And so I think that even though it may be the president's favorite tool to use, he certainly likes them, Congress is starting to think that maybe giving the president that much authority is not a great idea.
Yeah, and feeding into this was also, I think, arms sales to Saudi Arabia, for instance, that happened without congressional approval, and that obviously sparked a lot of outcry from Senate Republicans. So I think this is just a symptom of a much broader issue about the extent to which the president and the executive branch is willing to respect the boundaries of the legislature.
All right, after the break, the House votes on protections for Dreamers and TPS recipients. Finally today, earlier this month, the House passed the Dream and Promise Act, which would allow Dreamers, undocumented young people brought to the United States as children by their parents, a pathway to permanent legal status. This was the first immigration bill, unbelievably, to pass a House of Congress since the Senate Comprehensive Immigration Reform Plan in 2013. But while Democrats were united, the bill only won over 7 House Republicans, raising questions about whether it's going anywhere in the Republican-controlled Senate. Cris, let's start with a quick overview of the bill's provisions.
So the bill largely is similar to various iterations of the DREAM Act that we've seen for the last decade or so. Basically the way this law has been structured and the DREAM Act has been structured is that an individual who was brought to the United States as a child, as an undocumented immigrant by their parents who were undocumented immigrants, has to, be meeting some requirements of how many years they've resided in the United States, whether they're in the armed forces or they're, pursuing higher education, whether they meet certain requirements related to the criminal background. And if they're able to meet those requirements, then they receive a conditional status that then eventually, after a given number of years, they can then apply for a green card and then eventually from that become a U.S. citizen. Now, what is different between the Dream and Promise Act and the DREAM Act? I think broad level, there is some expansion for individuals who might be in trades as a requirement for higher education, that they can be, in trades and receive that be able to fulfill that as a requirement to be able to receive provisional status. In terms of criminal background, which was an area of debate among Democrats, it did make some a little bit more liberalization around issues around misdemeanors, particularly related to, for instance, marijuana-related misdemeanors. But at the same time, it still maintains some other, at least new components for criminal backgrounds. For instance, domestic violence. There's a new criminal bar that disqualifies applicants of that misdemeanor felony related to domestic violence convictions, for instance. So it tightened it up a little bit. The other, obviously, the big major part of this bill is that extended protections to individuals who are under TPS, so temporary protected status, for individuals with that status who are current or former holders of that status, and as well as deferred enforcement departure status as well. So it's expanding the pool of the number of individuals who might be able to get this conditional provisional status and maybe eventually get a green card.
So the pathway to passage in the House exposed some divisions within the House Democratic caucus. What were the hurdles, and did anything in the bill change along the way? Theresa, I'll put this to you.
Sure. So Since the original introduction of the DREAM Act and since the creation of the DACA program, there has been a push by immigration advocates and sort of the progressive wing of the Democrats to expand eligibility for this program, particularly when it comes to what sorts of criminal convictions would disqualify somebody. And this exposed some divisions among the Democrats. More moderate Democrats wanted to see some tighter provisions around things like domestic violence or other sort of misdemeanor criminal applications. Some of the progressive wing wanted to say, no, if it's long enough ago, those should not be disqualifying. That was a debate as the bill was being marked up in the Judiciary Committee. It also exposed some divisions on the floor. At the end of the day, I think the Democrats had to unite around this because it was fairly clear fairly early that they were not going to get any Republican support. The judiciary markup of this bill was very instructive because it was one of the ways that the Republicans on the committee tried to drive that wedge among the Democrats was introducing a lot of amendments around the criminal bars for these programs. So, again, I think the way this bill came together, it was a Democratic leadership bill. It had a low number. Usually when a party takes control, the first 10 bill numbers are reserved for so-called leadership bills that are bills that are important to the party, important to the leadership to pass. H.R. 6, the Dream and Promise Act, was one of them. And so it was very important to Democratic leadership that this get unanimous Democratic support. They were not as concerned with getting Republican support, and they really didn't invite Republicans in to the drafting or consideration of this. As I said, almost all of the amendments that were offered in Judiciary Committee were voted down along party lines. So it's, as you said, it's unclear what happens in a Republican-controlled Senate. The president has not supported this on its own, and it's not clear that a DREAM bill or a DREAM TPS bill can move on its own. So I think where it sits now is this is a marker bill. The House has passed. The Democrats have said, look, this is where we stand and this is what we want to do. But in terms of actual enactment or getting anywhere close to providing actual relief for the people it's supposed to help, I think we're a long ways away from that.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the issues with the bill's creation, I think, really undermine the capacity for Republicans to be able to really come out in support of this. I mean, from what we heard on the Hill, Democrats really did not make an effort to reach out to Republicans, as Theresa was noting. Not even in any type of discussions about what the bill should contain, how it should be shaped, which made it very much a partisan bill and very much a marker bill. So that, I think, kind of doomed it from the start, and it being a real, genuine bipartisan bill. But thinking about the Senate, obviously, the bill as it is just has no traction. And I did find it a little bit strange that the advocates really celebrated the bill, but really then turned around and said, it's up to Senate Republicans to vote for this. But this bill is not going to move. There aren't any meaningful concessions to Republicans on a whole host of issues. It's worth remembering that last year, during what I call the Valentine's Day Senate vote, that there were, at that point in time, there were several bipartisan bills that extended protections to Dreamers, but also had concessions from Democrats on border enforcement. But that's not the case here at all. And so the question is, moving forward, what can Democrats expect from a GOP-controlled Senate if they're not going to make any meaningful concessions? The analogy that I think about this is, it's like a 16-year-old their dad bought them a car, but the car doesn't have a wheel or a battery or gas. In other words, how is it going to get outside of the garage? And right now, if the Democrats want to be able to get that car outside the garage, there need to be concessions to get wheel, battery, and gas to get that car out of the garage.
So, Theresa, while this one is unclear of how it's moving forward, what other immigration legislation is on the docket for the rest of this year?
Well, another big focus of Democrats in the House, now that they control the House, is trying to have as regular a process for governmental appropriations as they possibly can. And so in the last week, the Democratic House Appropriations Committee debated and passed the Department of Homeland Security Appropriations Bill. And as it might be expected, the Democrats did use this bill to try to take some shots at things they don't like about the administration's immigration policy. There was a significant reduction in funding, for example, for immigration and customs enforcement, and especially for detention beds. But there was also money that was added, for example, for humanitarian support along the border. Interestingly enough, in committee, there was a bipartisan amendment adopted that would expand the current H-2A agricultural temporary worker program to encompass occupations that are year-round, particularly in dairy and livestock production. And this has been a long-standing request of the agriculture employer sector, and a bipartisan one at that. And it's interesting that although a lot of Democrats have concerns about the way that program is currently structured and how it treats workers, there is, as I said, enough pressure from the agricultural industry that amendment did pass. So I think that at least in the near term, many of these policy debates in Congress are going to come out as the appropriations bills move forward. Appropriations, of course, are the one thing that Congress has to do every year to keep the government going, and the administration has to sign to keep the government going. And so this becomes a vehicle for a lot of these various policy disputes to be weighed in. So we'll see how this proceeds as well.
All right. Theresa, Cris, thanks for joining me. And thanks to you all for listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks. In the meantime, please take a second to find us on Facebook by searching Bipartisan Policy Center, or on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. And don't forget to subscribe and leave your feedback on this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Just search Bipartisan Policy Center. This episode of This Week in Immigration was written by Cris, Ramón, and myself, and produced by Yafet Tawahada and Ashley Swearingen. That's all for now. Join us again next time on This Week in Immigration.